in the house of God. The Bible opens with a picture of a man walking and talking with God. God had made man and placed him in a garden. Here he was in the midst of beautiful surroundings. He enjoyed beloved companionship. He was given a pleasant and satisfying occupation. And the Bible closes with a picture of God dwelling with the redeemed of all ages in an eternal home where ignorance, poverty, pain, disappointment, failure, death, and separation are unknown. We heard that read this morning in Revelation chapter 21, the first 4 verses. Man's first picture finds him with God. Man's final destiny is intended to be with God if he will but respond to the divine efforts to forgive and redeem. It was sin that wrecked man's Garden of Eden. The Bible is a record of the activity of a gracious God who through the ages has sought to win man away from the way of rebellion and self-destruction. God would persuade us to walk by faith and obedience the way to fullness of joy and satisfying achievement. The psalmist hungered for fellowship with God. Psalm 15 was written by a man who assumed that many others would like to find again the position of privilege and the security with God that had been lost because of sin. This hunger and delight in the presence of God is repeated many times in the hymn book, the book of Psalms of the ancient Hebrews. How amiable are your tabernacles, O Lord of hosts! My soul longs, yes, even faints for the courts of the Lord. My heart and my flesh cry out for the living God. In Psalm 84, verses 1 and 2. And then he continues, for a day in your courts is better than 1,000. I had rather be a doorkeeper in the house of God than to dwell in the tents of wickedness. To dwell in the presence of God was to enjoy safety. He says, I was glad when they said unto me, let us go into the house of the Lord, in Psalm 122, verse 1. He that dwells in the secret place of the Most High shall abide under the shadow of the Almighty, in Psalm 91, verse 1. Man needs the security of a sense of the presence of God in this modern age, when the only thing that is certain is change. And we see it all around us. Everything is changing. Not necessarily for the better, but everything changes. Men's hearts are easily captured by fear when they have no answer or they have no awareness in the presence of God in the events that are taking place around us. The psalmist believed that the highest possible Human satisfaction was to be found in the presence of God. Life apart from God was barren and incomplete, but with him, life could be joyful. You will show me the path of life. In your presence is full of joy. At your right hand there are pleasures forevermore. He says in Psalm 16, verse 11. David pictured this experience in terms of a feast by the divine host. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil, and my cup runs over. And we all know that one. Psalm 23, verse 5. The psalmist had observed that those whose character and purpose of life permitted them to enjoy the friendship and fellowship of God enjoyed a wonderful stability that was to be desired by everyone. He declares this conclusion in the last sentence of the psalm. He that does these things shall never be moved. Psalm 15, verse 5. The writer of the first psalm had made the same observation. He described the fruit of the life of the man who lived in the house of God in beautiful terms. And he shall be like a tree planted by the rivers of water that brings forth his fruit in his season. His leaf also shall not wither, and whatsoever he does shall prosper. In Psalm 1, verse 3. A pointed question is put to God. The psalmist pictures God as dwelling in a tent, pitched perhaps out in the wilderness. The Hebrews loved to think of God's earthly dwelling as a tent or a house of curtains. And the low spreading tent with its curtains represented better the clouds which veiled God in the heavens. A question is put to God. Inquiry is made as to what kind of traveler is worthy to halt and crave hospitality from Jehovah. Who shall be found worthy to be a citizen of Zion? Who can be a guest and dwell as a permanent resident? The tent and the holy hill is the tabernacle which David built on Mount Moriah, or Moriah, whichever way you want to say it, when he removed the ark from the house of Obed-Edom in Jerusalem. They are thought of here in their spiritual character as the places of the divine presence and the community of God gathered round this holy place. The idea is not that of frequenting Zion as a place of worship, but of dwelling there as a guest or as an inmate of God's family. It is a picture of communion and participation in his favor. The question is asked for a twofold purpose. In the first place, the question was raised in order to exclude men whose lives were wicked and hypocritical from coming to the sanctuary and altar with a false and superstitious idea that these appointments of worship possessed some mystical virtue that could secure exemption from punishment or a toleration of falsehood, impurity, or wrong. And the question is a repetition in another form of the positive declaration in Psalm 5, verse 4. For you are not a God that has pleasure in wickedness, neither shall evil dwell with you. It is declared that God's holy court, with all of its sacred privileges, is a place of blessing and honor, only for those whose character is true and pure. And then a detailed answer is given. Verse 2. Verse 2 gives a positive answer to the pointed question which had been directed to God. The answer is not to be taken as a direct answer from God. The psalmist presents himself as a suppliant before God. He reads, as it were, what is passing through God's heart, and he himself answers in accordance with the mind of God the question which he himself had just asked. He who would dwell with God must walk uprightly. Walking is used to represent the habitual course of life. His way of life must be blameless, innocent, sincere, and complete. There must not be any known, unconfessed, and unforsaken sin in his life. In all of the essential features of the character, there must be a sincere practice of genuine religion. The guest in the house of God is one who works righteousness. His life is one of positive goodness. As our Lord went about doing good, so must his followers do something more than just make a good profession with the mouth. You know, a lot of people talk a good game, but they don't walk the walk. There must be the sermon of loving kindness, which is pronounced and punctuated by good deeds. He is a worker for God and a worker for his fellow man. To have the privilege of dwelling in the holy hill of God, the guest must practice a rigid control over the use of his tongue. Now, everybody listen up here. Everybody. We all need to listen up. Perfect truthfulness should characterize the speech of the child of God. The person with whom God will be pleased is the one who does not permit his tongue to communicate that which is untrue, hurtful, and destructive to others. He is one who can be counted on to be honest and truthful in all of his conversation. Now, the negative side of this truth is also spotlighted. He who would be God's guest will have some great refusals in his life. He will refuse to use his tongue destructively. He will not be guilty of slander. He will be no talebearer. No one will be able to accuse him truthfully of being a gossip. That's a mouthful. He will not spread false reports. The church, the home, and the community would be greatly benefited if each of us would try to let our tongues be genuinely converted. There are several questions that could be asked with great profit before repeating many of the things which come to our ears? Is it truthful? Is it kind? Would I be willing to face the people with the criticism or story which I have heard and which I am tempted to repeat? No, most people just want to rush off and tell someone else. But is it truthful? Is it kind? Would I be willing to face the person with the criticism or story that I've just heard and am tempted to repeat? Will Christ be pleased with the repetition of the story? We must let Christ censor our thoughts if we would regulate our words, because the tongue reveals the thoughts that we harbor in our mind. God's guest is a doer of good to his neighbor rather than a doer of that which is evil. This is possible because the love of God, which is the experience of those who dwell with him. The inspired writer further discloses that he who is granted to dwell with God is a man of integrity, who honors those who are genuine and worthy, and utterly abhors those who are reprobate. A reprobate is one who is not genuine. He is not sincere. He is a counterfeit. He is a false medal that does not pass inspection. The guest of God is one who refuses to whitewash iniquity or sin, even when iniquity or sin is personified in one who claims or appears to be great. This person is further described as one who is dependable to the extent that he refuses to back out on a contract, even if he discovers that he is going to suffer loss. I had my roof one time. I had done twice. But when the guy gave me this estimate to do my roof, it was around $20,000. I don't remember the exact amount. Well, they went at it, and they were working and working. And he said, "Clarence, I'm losing money. If this is going to cost me about $30,000 when all is said and done." He said, "I really underestimated how much time it was going to take to do this." And I thought, wonderful. I don't have $30,000. And then he said, I didn't say that to him. I thought, I don't have $30,000. I still don't have it. But he said, I gave you an estimate of $20,000, and I will stick with it. He said, and I will take the loss. And so he took a loss of about $10,000 on doing the roof. And then the stupid place burned down. Well, he was owed 10 and I was owed 20. But he wouldn't back out of the contract. And he wouldn't say, now you have to pay this much. Furthermore, to dwell with God, one must refuse to profit from the pain of the unfortunate. In the days of the psalmist, men did not borrow money except in times of great necessity. Those who loaned money were dealing with souls in pitiful distress. Only drought, famine, war, sickness, or some other tragedy caused men to borrow. He who continued to enjoy God's favor was never to take advantage of the sufferings of the helpless. Money was to be loaned as an act of mercy rather than a means of making a high profit. Usury and bribery were two of the most common and flagrant offenses against justice. And just this week, Marion and I were watching the three judges called Hot Bench. And there was one on there, and the person in the stand was saying this one charged him this much for doing whatever. And he signed a contract to pay it. And the judge said, one of the judges said, well, we'll look at this. Yes, he can charge you money, but this is an exorbitant amount. She said, this is usury. And I didn't think anybody paid any attention to that anymore. And she said, we'll do away with that part of the contract because it's not reasonable. Usury apparently is still illegal. And I was delighted to hear them say that because I had no idea. But there are those who will take advantage of everybody, especially if they're down and out. And in that courtroom, they weren't allowed. The psalmist declares that he was guilty of taking advantage of the unfortunate, like the widow or the orphan, could not expect to enjoy the presence and the favor of the God of Israel. They who dwell with God and enjoy His presence, His protection, and His provisions must be men and women of high ethical and moral character with genuine faith and a faithfulness that expresses itself in kindness and mercy. Who is sufficient and adequate? Only through Jesus Christ can our sins be forgiven, and can we find the inward strength and guidance that can make possible for us a life of fruitful fellowship with God and His people. Amen.